Wow, you guys have really sent us down a rabbit hole this time, huh? It seems like you're all really fascinated by geopolitics and potential conflicts, especially the ones brewing in the Middle East, and the source material this time. Well, let's just say it's definitely something else.
You can say that
We're
again.
talking about this YouTube video featuring Krzysztof Jackowski, a Polish psychic.
Hmm.
Not exactly our usual cup of tea, but that's the thing I love about these deep dives. Always keep things interesting.
Right.
So are you ready to unpack Jackowski's predictions about the global landscape?
Let's do it.
Okay, so one of the first things that really jumped out at me was his claim about a secret deal between Trump and Putin going all the way back to November 2020. He even uses Assad fleeing Syria and Russia pulling out around the same time as evidence. Is there any weight to that timeline? Or is it a bit of a stretch?
Well, it's worth noting that November 2020 was already a pretty intense time in global politics. I mean, you had the U.S. election in full swing, and tensions surrounding Syria and Ukraine were definitely on the rise. So if
Ah,
there was some kind of agreement, even an unspoken one, it would signal a major shift in the balance of power, right? You could see Russia gaining more influence in Eastern Europe while the U.S. is busy focusing on containing China in the Pacific.
it's like this giant game of chess, isn't it? And Joukowsky doesn't mince words when he describes Trump's actions regarding Ukraine. He uses the word adage, which means gives away. What implications does that have for a country like Ukraine caught in the middle of all this?
Well, the word odaje definitely paints Ukraine as a pawn in a much larger game. It raises a big question, too. How much autonomy do these smaller nations really have when the global superpowers are making deals behind closed doors?
And this alleged deal between Trump and Putin feeds right into Joukowsky's next prediction, a major conflict in the Middle East, potentially triggered by an Israeli attack on Iran. Given the history between those two nations, it's not totally out of left field, but are we really on the brink of another major war in the region?
We can't ignore the historical context here. The shadow war between Israel and Iran has been simmering for decades, fueled by proxy conflicts and political maneuvering. So as alarming as it is, Joukowsky's prediction isn't all that surprising given the current situation.
Okay, so this is where things get even more interesting. Joukowsky claims the initial stages of this conflict will be theatrical, like it's designed to manipulate public opinion, almost like a staged performance rather than a genuine conflict.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought. Think about it, though. Historical propaganda campaigns, the way information is twisted on social media, if Tchaikovsky's right, we could be headed towards a future where it's almost impossible to distinguish reality from carefully crafted narratives.
It's definitely unsettling to think about, especially in today's world where information travels so fast. It makes you wonder what role the media will play in shaping how we perceive these events.
Absolutely. If this conflict unfolds the way Tchaikovsky predicts, media literacy and critical thinking are going to be more crucial than ever.
And unfortunately, the predictions don't get any more optimistic from there. Joukowsky sees a weakened Europe struggling with a migrant crisis and economic turmoil as a direct consequence of this conflict in the Middle East.
It really makes you question how resilient the European Union truly is. Open borders, economic interdependence, a lack of a unified military force. Could those factors make them especially vulnerable to a crisis like this?
And if Europe is weakened, what happens to the countries on its borders? Like Poland, Joukowsky seems fixated on Poland's fate. He predicts a huge influx of refugees and potential changes to its borders.
Well, geographically speaking, Poland has always been in a vulnerable spot, sandwiched between Russia and the EU. And history shows us that Poland has often been caught in the crossfire of larger conflicts. Joukowsky's predictions are concerning for sure, but they highlight that vulnerability.
It's a lot to take in. And it gets even more cryptic when Joukowsky predicts that Poland will be divided into two categories of people. He doesn't elaborate on what that means, but it sounds ominous.
It definitely begs for interpretation. What do these two categories represent? Social divisions, economic disparity, political allegiances, or maybe even a split between those who can adapt to this changing world and those who can't.
And in the midst of all these predictions of conflict and upheaval, Joukowsky uses a very striking symbol. A young boy running through a field with a bag of candy. He says it represents the beginning of a global crisis. What do you make of that?
Well, symbolism in prophecy and divination often taps into our subconscious fears and anxieties. It's interesting how this particular image juxtaposes the innocence of childhood with the potential for global turmoil. It's jarring.
It's a powerful image, that's for sure. One that sticks with you.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Is the candy a brief moment of sweetness before things go sour? Or is it something more sinister, like a false sense of security before disaster strikes?
Yeah, it really gets under your skin, doesn't it? But let's shift gears a bit and dig into another part of Zdzikowski's predictions, this whole potential migrant crisis.
Mm.
He specifically mentions people from Israel evacuating and coming here, meaning to Poland.
And it sounds like he sees this as more than just a temporary wave of refugees, right? He uses language that suggests a permanent change, saying these people will enter Poland and not leave, maybe even dividing the country into two categories. He even says maybe three. What could that division actually look like?
Well, history has shown us over and over again that large-scale migrations can really shake things up, socially and culturally. I mean, imagine a huge influx of people with different customs and religions, different ways of life altogether. It's bound to create some friction, especially in a country like Poland with a strong sense of national identity. Yeah, it makes you think about the potential for social tension, maybe even conflict between groups, competing for resources, trying to adapt to this new reality.
Exactly. And remember, Jackowski doesn't specify if this migration is voluntary or forced. Is he saying Poland becomes a safe haven by choice? Or is there something darker going on here, like some kind of forced displacement orchestrated by outside forces?
That's a disturbing thought, for sure.
Mhm.
And it ties into his prediction about potential changes to Poland's borders. He doesn't go into detail about that. But given Poland's history of border shifts because of war and political maneuvering, it's definitely cause for concern.
Oh, absolutely. Poland has been a crossroads of empires for centuries. Its borders have been redrawn time and time again, always by the whims of larger powers. So if Jackowski's prediction is accurate, who knows what those borders might look like in the future?
It's a bit unsettling to imagine Poland's map being redrawn yet again, especially under such chaotic circumstances. And it's interesting how Jackowski contrasts Poland's fate with what he sees happening in Europe as a whole. He talks about Europe being weakened by this conflict, claiming it's the beginning of the end for the European Union.
That prediction really speaks to this bigger debate about the EU's long-term survival. Critics often point to the bureaucracy, the economic gaps between member states, the lack of a unified foreign policy. They see it as a weakness. Could those factors lead to its collapse under the pressure of a major conflict, a global crisis?
So it's like, on one hand, you have Poland potentially facing a huge wave of refugees and border changes, but maybe avoiding the worst of the fighting. And on the other hand, you have Europe potentially fracturing and collapsing under the weight of this crisis. It's a lot to process.
It is. It's a complex and multifaceted vision of the future, and it definitely raises more questions than answers. Is this influx of refugees into Poland truly voluntary, or is there some coercion involved? What role will external forces play in reshaping Poland's borders? And can the European Union withstand this storm, or is it destined to crumble?
Let's not forget, Jackowski isn't just talking about localized conflicts. He uses the term Great War, implying something even bigger and more destructive than what he predicts in Ukraine and the Middle East. It's almost like he sees these regional wars as a prelude to something even more catastrophic.
That's a chilling thought. Is he suggesting that these regional conflicts could spiral out of control, eventually drawing in other major powers and leading to a global confrontation? It's a question that's haunted humanity for centuries, and in a world with nuclear weapons and these interconnected economies, the stakes are higher than ever before.
It's a stark reminder that even conflicts that seem far away can have a ripple effect across the globe, and with the potential for a great war looming on the horizon. The question is, what can we do to prevent this worst-case scenario from happening?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
If Jackowski is right about all of this, it's not enough to just analyze and understand his predictions. We need to think critically about what might happen and consider what actions can be taken to mitigate the risks.
Speaking of risks, Jackowski also mentions a great crisis that will happen alongside this great war. He specifically highlights China's growing influence in the Middle East. It sounds like he sees China playing a major role in this unfolding global drama.
Well, China has been strategically positioning itself in the Middle East for years now, securing energy deals, building infrastructure, fostering diplomatic ties. Wouldn't be surprising to see them leveraging that influence in a world reshaped by conflict and crisis.
It almost makes you wonder if China's playing the long game here, waiting for the current world order to collapse so they can step in and fill the void.
It's a definite possibility worth considering. And then, amidst all this talk of war and economic upheaval, Jackowski drops another chilling prediction: the eradication of the Quran from certain parts of the Middle East.
Wow, that's a deeply disturbing statement. It raises serious concerns about religious persecution and potential human rights violations on a massive scale. What could possibly drive such a drastic action?
It's hard to say for sure, But it's not hard to imagine a scenario where religious extremism or geopolitical ambitions lead to a campaign of intolerance and violence. The idea of wiping out an entire religion from a region is abhorrent. It's a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred and fanaticism.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the darker side of humanity and how easily conflict can spiral into something truly horrific. It can be a bit overwhelming to process all of these predictions, especially the darker ones.
I get that. It's heavy stuff. We're talking about complex geopolitics, potential conflicts, predictions about the future, all inherently uncertain. But remember, knowledge is power, right? By exploring these topics and really thinking them through, we can start to understand the forces at play in the world, maybe even figure out how to reduce some of these risks.
It's like that saying, forewarned is forearmed, right? So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Jackowski's predictions, what are the key takeaways here? What should our listeners be thinking about as they navigate this increasingly complex world?
Well, first things first, it's important to remember that these are just predictions from one source. We should be skeptical and weigh them against other perspectives and analysis. But even if we don't take everything as gospel truth, they offer a really interesting glimpse into what the future could hold.
Right. It's not about blindly believing these predictions, but using them to think critically and explore further.
Exactly. And when you look at these predictions alongside current events and historical trends, some clear themes start to emerge, like a potential power shift on the global stage. Maybe the U.S. steps back from its traditional leadership role, leaving a vacuum for other powers like Russia and China to fill.
It's almost like the ground is shifting beneath our feet, creating a new global landscape full of uncertainty, potential for conflict, but also for cooperation.
Exactly. And within that shifting landscape, we see the potential for more regional instability and conflict, especially in the Middle East. And that could impact the whole world, from migration patterns to economic disruptions.
And it's important to remember, these conflicts aren't just about political power or territory. They often tap into deeper social and cultural tensions, raising the possibility of religious persecution, human rights violations, even the erosion of the values that many of us hold dear.
That's why it's so crucial to have these conversations, to be aware of what's happening, to think critically about the choices we make, both individually and as a global community, because in the end, the future isn't set in stone. We shape it through our actions and decisions.
So as we leave our listeners with these final thoughts, what's the one question you hope they keep pondering?
If we accept that these dark scenarios could actually happen, what can we do as individuals and as a collective to steer the world towards a more peaceful and just future? What choices can we make? What actions can we take to create a world where cooperation wins out over conflict, where understanding bridges the divides, and where everyone's human dignity is respected?
That's a powerful question to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Krzysztof Jackowski's predictions. Remember, it's up to each of us to decide how we respond to this information and what role we want to play in shaping the future. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains buzzing.